Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. How are you over there?
Very fine, thank you, sir. Adjusting to our usual yo-yo weather on this side. 1 minute it was raining, the next minute the sun was out. And just before we knew what was happening, now we seem to be maybe 5 degrees or something like that. We're getting used to it.
Preparing for the coronation, I suppose.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes,
let's all pray for the good weather on that day.
Well, I guess we're getting used to it. If it rains, there will be coronation. If it doesn't rain, there will be coronation. So we're getting used to that, sir. And thank you to our viewers who have joined in as well across the different platforms. So just like last week, I'm not sure who we had last week. So if I'm sounding like I'm repeating myself, apologies for that. But this week is a town hall style session. And what that means is that we allow the audience to participate. If your video is clear enough and your audio is clear enough, we'll bring you on board to ask your questions or to contribute to the point that is being discussed. How did we get here? 2 weeks ago, Professor Akinyemi raised a few points in response to a question that someone had asked. And that question was, how do we get Nigeria back as a major foreign policy player back on the global scene and on the world scene? And Professor Akinyemi mentioned 3 points. The first one was building a nuclear industrial capability. The second one was about a South Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the third one, which was a very radical one, was about developing a space program by partnering with individuals, entrepreneurs who had built that kind of capacity out there. So that's the background to how we got to the program this evening. But sir, just like I did last week, I'm going to ask you a question before we start to look at the point around the South Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is linked as well, sir. Finland has now officially become part of NATO. And it would be good to hear your views about that, given the topic for today, where we're looking at maybe we say the pros and cons of a South Atlantic Treaty Organization. Over to you, sir, regarding Finland, your views regarding Finland joining NATO and what that means for the region.
Thank you very much for that intro. I will even broaden it a little bit wider. Not only has Finland joined, Sweden has also applied, for membership, and it's just been blocked by the veto exercised by Turkey. Then they came up with a concept of Friends of NATO, which allowed them to bring in Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan. And that means there is some elasticity to your definition of spatial places in geography. It depends on what you want to do with the area that you are demarcating. I mean, if they could go as far as bringing in Australia and New Zealand and Japan as friends of NATO, nothing prevents them from bringing in African countries on one hand, and South American countries on the other hand as friends of NATO. So, and this was what I was afraid of, the expansion of spatial places to fit military and conflict objectives, when I suggested that we should quickly carve out our own definition of the South Atlantic Ocean, the area that we want to protect. Obviously, geographically speaking, and I think the United Nations in 1986, I believe, led the development in carving out just South Atlantic Ocean. It didn't make it it didn't put it in a treaty form, and it didn't put it in a military form. Nations on the African side and nations on the South American side were members. And last year, June, a conference was held in Morocco towards putting teeth into the South Atlantic Ocean as defined by the United Nations. The United Nations wants a zone of peace, and that is within what I also have in mind. But it is left it loosely, is geographically defined. What I have in mind is a body that will keep us free of other people's conflict. Define and create a zone that will prevent others from, just as we've seen in the North Atlantic Ocean, creating friends of NATO and picking on Angola or even Nigeria or Cameroon, on the other side, Brazil, Chile, making them friends of NATO, or since China is also now spreading its wings strategically, seeking to poach into this South Atlantic Ocean. That's what I had in mind. And I still think that it can be accommodated within even what the United Nations has set up. Because if you have a loose definition that includes Morocco on the north, where Morocco itself is claiming to be the southern part of Europe politically, then what kind of strategic objectives will you be trying to create by having a South Atlantic Ocean? And since it has not been done yet, I believe this is an area where Nigeria can take the initiative, because I'm sure a country like Brazil will not actually want to be dragged, to use Macron's definition. I mean, when Macron was in China, he was saying that Europe should be careful that the United States does not drag it into the conflict over Taiwan. So I don't think that we in Africa, nor Brazil for that matter, we want to be dragged into the problems of the Mediterranean, which we know is basically an Arab-Israeli conflict area, and it could spill over at any time. So that really, in short, is what I have in mind. And I would please like to appeal to our members on this platform to please be robust in taking me on, in criticizing, my concept, in expanding it, in shrinking it, so we can have not a monologue and definitely not a dialogue, but we could have a robust discussion as the second leg of our contribution to whoever takes over, whoever is running in May 29th. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, sir. And on that note, I will open the floor. Please do raise your hand and the team will allow you in. Do you agree with Professor Akinyemi on his submission there, that we have a South Atlantic Treaty Organization? Would that be beneficial to the region at all? Would people be interested? Would other countries be interested in even partaking in that sort of organization, given some of the accusations of dominance from NATO and some of the bombing campaigns that we've seen from NATO in the past? So do you share the same views as Professor Akinyemi? Do you disagree with him on that point? If you please raise your hand, and the team will allow you in to comment on that point. Please do raise your hand. There is an option right at the bottom of your screen that you can click on to raise your hand. And once I see the hand raised up, I will allow you in. So I'll keep an eye on that. But while we wait for the comments to come in, sir, one point that has struck a lot of people is that obviously the war in Ukraine has accelerated the need for Sweden, the need for Finland to apply to be part of NATO. Obviously, the war has struck some kind of fear into them to join NATO. One question I have for you, sir, is this, and you've touched on it slightly. Why would African countries who are in the region of the South Atlantic, why would they feel that being part of a body like this would be important to them? Because from their perspective, we already have NATO, it's established. It's probably a lot easier for NATO to expand into that region than it is to set up a completely different organization to mirror what NATO is doing. How would you respond to that sort of argument, sir?
The answer is embedded in actually what is driving my proposal, which is we don't want anybody to expand into what is basically our backyard. Um, and in fact, there is one extra point, which will make this very clear, which I ought to emphasize. If you take a low flight, say from Senegal all the way down to Angola, you will be amazed at the number of Japanese, Chinese, and South Korean fishing vessels that litter the whole of this area. And there are studies that are already done, which shows that, number one, these fishing vessels who are in violation of the economic exclusive zone that should be exclusive to the coastal countries in this area. The type of fishing that they are doing is detrimental to our economic interests, because what they are using is what they call scooping. They have the scooping from the floor. Normally, when fisheries take place, it is the adult fish that come to the top of the ocean. And so your fishing net takes off the mature fish. But when you scoop from below, you take the eggs, which have not even hatched, you take the babies, which have not matured, you take everything, and you then leave the coastal states with nothing. We have seen this happen to Liberia. We have seen this happen to Sierra Leone. And this, even it has happened to us. You'll be amazed as to, even though the federal government made funds available for Nigerians to set up fishing industries, they never really succeeded, because number one, there are areas, the areas that should be exclusive to them were not monitored, were not protected by our navies. If you have important navies sufficiently strong enough to drive these Asian fishing vessels further into the deep sea, then you protect the economic interests of the coastal areas. But because we don't have navies that are doing this on a permanent basis, I just don't mean the occasional passage of naval vessels, the occasional monitoring, but a constant presence, even if the naval boats have to rotate, say, every 6 months, so that these Asian fishing vessels will not come to destroy the entire livelihood of the people there. So it's not even just the military aspects that are of major interest. The economic aspects are equally important. And you cannot, I mean, as the world, and this is the expectation, that the world will increasingly go into this overdrive in their search for in their search for to compensate for the agricultural problems that they have. Then it's not even just the Asian vessels. You will have American vessels, North American vessels, European fishing vessels that will come to depopulate the whole of the fishing industry in these areas. So your question actually points to the point I'm trying to make, that we don't want interlopers. Under international law, this is, the exclusive economic zone. It's an area that belongs to us. But I'm also now suggesting that in cooperation with the countries on the where from Africa, you will call them the countries on the western continental shelf of the Americas, that we should cooperate in protecting ourselves economically and in protecting ourselves militarily from incursions by anybody that may want to come in.
Thank you, sir. To our viewers, please do raise your hands. Let me know if you want to make your comment. We really do want to hear your comments about this point relating to a South Atlantic Treaty Organization. But sir, there is a big question that someone raised with me in the lead up to this when they knew we were going to be discussing this topic. The United States is a major contributor to NATO, and we know that their contribution has not been cheap. It's been quite a sizable amount of money that has gone into funding NATO and making sure that NATO is what NATO is today. In advising the new administration in Nigeria to take the lead, does that then not commit the administration to funding that they probably should be putting elsewhere? Can Nigeria sustain a South Atlantic Treaty Organization as the major financier or the major contributor to that sort of organization? Again, to our viewers, please do raise your hand. As soon as we see it, the team will let me know, and we can bring you on to contribute to the discussion. But sir, what would you say to that?
That's a valid question to raise, except that in the case of the South Atlantic Ocean, Nigeria will not be the main contributor. Look at the major giants that are on both sides of the ocean. On the African side, you have Nigeria, you have Cameroon, and I'm talking about countries that have economies on which contributions could be based. You have Angola, you have the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I know some people may laugh that not the Congo that is in a mess. That is true. But in fact, we, or the South Atlantic Treaty Organization, if accepted, could be a contributor to stabilizing the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because we know that it is because of its mineral resources that outside interlopers have become involved in destabilizing that country. Then you go down to Angola, and then you go down to South Africa. That is on this side. On the South American side, you've got Brazil, you've got Chile. Those are the two, I believe. I may be wrong here, But those are the two that I believe are the giants on the South American side. So in a way, we're talking about, let's have a round figure. We're talking about, 10 major contributors, depending on how you the geographical definition you give to the concept. So Nigeria will not be the only contributor or even the major contributor. There are others that are equally well endowed. And you've got to do a balancing act. I just showed you, I'm sure there must be studies done by multinational organizations about the fisheries, the loss to African economies of the way and manner in which Asian Asian shipping lines, fishery lines, come to scoop up the fishery resources of Africa. So you can then imagine what also you will be gaining. Obviously, you give your Navy a job to do so that they are not just sailing up and down, showing flags. They will also be making, a contribution that will enhance their mandate, but they will be saving economic resources for the countries that are in this area. But there is no doubt that there will always be complaints. Even the United States complains about lack of contribution, sufficient contribution by European countries to the expenses of NATO, that the United States is carrying a burden that is not proportional or that is in excess of what it should be carrying. You always have this. We have it in ECOWAS. We have it in even in the United Nations. A lot of countries default annually in their contribution. So I expect that there will be, robust debates as regards who will contribute what to the safeguarding of the South Atlantic Ocean.
Thank you for that, sir. I can see some hands raised, and I will call you in the order in which those were presented. Unfortunately, for the first person, it just says iPhone. Can you please identify yourself before speaking, but go ahead and speak.
Okay, hello.
Go ahead, we can hear you.
My name is Jayola Lewu.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, how are you?
Fine, thank you, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, the issue of South Atlantic as a zone of peace and cooperation has always been on for so many years. I really don't know which aspect our honorable professor is trying to put forward. Is it a treaty that's similar to that of the North Atlantic? Or is it that we should try and revive the South Atlantic Treaty, South Atlantic Zone of Peace and Cooperation that has been existing, whose headquarters is in Brazil, where I used to be, and also which has been recognized by the United Nations. So I really don't know whether the organization is in a limbo, and the professor now wants that organization to rise up from its slumber and come up with what is very important and valuable to the member states that are involved. those in the whole of from Dakar all the way to South Africa, and also from the Caribbeans all the way to Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina.
Well, thank
Thank
you, Ambassador Leo. I actually acknowledged the setting up by the United Nations in 1986 of this zone as one for peace. I also acknowledge the fact that in June last year, a meeting was held in Morocco to breathe life into the zone set up by the United Nations. But I also said that the zone as set up by the United Nations is a nebulous one. It's just geographically defined. And you know, just to say we are a zone of peace and a zone of development is something that is broadly defined. Now, let us put some teeth into it. If it is going to be a zone of peace, then we have to start defining where the threats are likely to come from. And having seen NATO go as far as Australia and New Zealand and Japan to expand the definition of NATO under the umbrella of Friends of NATO, I'm rather worried that given the conflict, the tendency for superpowers to expand their areas of interest, I'm rather worried. And I have been worried actually since 1976, before the United Nations came up with this zone. Incidentally, I don't know how it means me because, I was a minister in 1986, and I don't even remember that this was set up until I was doing some background checking for this program, that something was set up in 1986. And it showed, I would say, the extent to which it didn't resonate amongst members. And what I'm asking for is for teeth and substance to be put into this. I must admit that even now I have problems. I have problems dovetailing what I have in mind with what the United Nations created. Because something that starts in Morocco, and as you rightly pointed out, goes all the way down. Even as one article I was reading was talking about, and the Antarctic Ocean being the southernmost ocean of the South Atlantic Ocean. Obviously, that's not what I have in mind. Mine is rather limited, but the limitation will come, as you very well know, when experts start to meet, diplomats start to meet, but somebody or some core members will have to meet and define the limitations and define the objectives. So what I have in mind is, I'm afraid, is different from what the United Nations has sought to create.
All right, sir. I have, again, apologies, I don't know all the names, but there is Olusegun Akinsanya. You had your hand raised up. Please go ahead and make your comments.
That's Ambassador Akinsanya.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, moderator, and thanks to Professor Akinyemi. We have always known him to be thinking without the box. And I'm sure that all that he's been able to explain for this idea is a good one. Definitely, we will have other countries like South Africa, Brazil to grapple with. My intervention will be along the same lines with Jaye Leu, and you have already given some explanation. But coming back to Africa, particularly within the African Union, and in terms of some of the initiatives that Nigeria has pursued in the past and is still pursuing. I have in mind the Pelindaba Treaty. Peace talked about the denuclearization of Africa. It was one of the very specific projects that Nigeria pursued within the AU and Africa. But what happened? Well, not only it was an idea of late Ambassador Oluwadeniji, which was pursued within the AU, but it has lost steam. Same with coming nearer home is the Gulf of Guinea Commission. The Gulf of Guinea Commission that has Nigeria as a lead country, you have Gabon, you have Cameroon. We even have one of us as the executive secretary, Nickel Konga. But it is the same thing that, you know, the national initial enthusiasm in protecting the Atlantic, in providing the capacity, seems to be losing steam. I'm worried about the political agenda of the next government. You think this idea will be a priority to the extent that even foreign policy does not feature prominently in all the campaign elements, except, you know, for SDP that spoke at the NIA. So will you think that this idea that you have is going to be carried forward? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the will? And given all some of the experiences that I've enumerated, do you think this will fly, Professor? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Akinyemi. It's been my own experience. Admittedly, a short one within the ministry, that leadership is the answer, is the engine that drives initiatives. If you have a minister who has defined objectives in mind, you are quite right that foreign policy did not matter much in the manifestos of these political parties, the major ones. But you see, they seldom do, because you can't start talking about things in abstract. We've got to admit that foreign policy in its initial stage is something you will talk about in abstract. It's by far so easy to say, well, yes, Africa will be the centerpiece of our foreign policy. And no, you have nobody picks you up, maybe during a debate, to define what you mean by centerpiece, because it will lead you into identifying the objectives, identifying the difficulties in Africa, and what your contribution would be, along with people whom you will seek to lobby. But once you then get into office, you then find out that even if you leave foreign policy alone, foreign policy is not going to leave you alone. It's going to come knocking on your doors. I know the problem that I had when we were thinking about the technical lead course scheme. And I should use this opportunity to pay, I mean, to pay homage to the contribution made by the foreign policy, the think tank within the minister's office. Because once the idea was then sold on to them and they enriched the idea, it then became easy for me to sell it to General Babangida as president. Because basically it was, you have a foreign policy, a foreign aid budget. You know African countries are going to come knocking on your door, asking for assistance for this, for that. Instead of giving it to them in cash, why don't you suggest that, rather than give it to you in cash, we will give it to you in kind. I recall that the first country that we actually dealt with almost an experiment was Burkina Faso. And what was Thomas Sankara asking for? He said, look, I want my people to start learning how to speak English. I want to start with primary school and then secondary school. We need money to bring in English speakers, English teachers. And so we then offered, we will not only build the schools for you, we will supply the English-speaking teachers, and we will pay their salaries. And he was so excited by the idea. And I came back and I told President Babangida, this is precisely the kind of thing we had in mind. I mean, honestly speaking, when I was sworn in as a minister, TAC was not on my mind because, it wasn't some issue, immediate issue. It was when Thomas Sankara got into office and he made that request that I remember Rick Bisala saying to me, sir, but this is what you were speaking about not giving money, but our putting things in kind. So you are absolutely right that we haven't, the political parties have not given us any indication that they are thinking about foreign policy. But then, as I said, the foreign policy will come knocking on their doors, even when they are not knocking on the doors of foreign policy. That's number one. Number two, and I am equally as worried about you. And there are a few others on this platform who privately have spoken to me about the lack of consistency in the objectives that we pursue. Do you know that actually an attempt was made to scrap the technical aid course scheme when Obasanjo came back in 1999? An attempt was made to scrap it, but it had more defenders who had seen what we were gaining from it. Yesterday, I was at a meeting when somebody spoke about, he led a delegation to Kigali, to Rwanda, and they went to visit their teaching hospital there. And the director of that teaching hospital, the university teaching hospital, was a Nigerian doctor who had gone to do TAC in Kigali and was then kept there by the government to help them rehabilitate the teaching hospital and stay on to run it. Now, if the Nigerian government, if Obasanjo had said, no, I'm scrapping it, well, there's very little anybody could do about it. So in a way, we must find a way of, you know, I mean, when you read books on American foreign policy or Russian foreign policy, you will see the continuity of objectives, even if they have to continue to refine it. But our problem here is, oh, well, we are not interested in that objective. It was brought by XYZ, it's no longer here. I must bring up my own. The same problem you have now with governors who come in, do 4 years or 8 years, leave abandoned projects, and then when new governors come in, they want to start their own. They don't want to complete what is there. So that's what we have to address in our foreign policy establishment, continuity.
Thank you, sir. I can see Professor Akinyemi. Your hand is raised, sir. Can you please go ahead, unmute yourself, sir?
Okay, thank you, sir. I listened attentively to Ambassador Lew and Ambassador Akinyemi. The mentioning of the Treaty of Pelindaba and the challenges that we have been accustomed to on the South Atlantic Treaty, I think that the challenges are raised by the two ambassadors, and particularly in light of what Professor Joyogu had written on this particular matter, are precisely what Professor Akinyemi, the way I understood it, is saying that we have to address. Now, the fundamental difference between all the efforts so far that have not worked or that are on the path of going into desuetude is simply because Nigeria as a country, as one entity, as one body, does not have any control. For instance, when Mr. Moderator himself asked the question as to whether Nigeria would be able to fund the activities of possibly a new organization, I think that even though Professor Akinyemi did say that Nigeria will not be the only one, the reality is that Nigeria cannot but be the primus inter pares to be able to control, and the challenge will be adequate funding, more funding. You see, what Professor Akinyemi is suggesting again, I will repeat, he's always living far ahead his peers. He's living in the future. He's addressing problems with conjectural methodologies. So he's always far ahead. And I think that we cannot move forward by limiting ourselves to the challenges of the past. If we are to do this, fair enough, Ambassador Nike Okunga, within the framework of the Guinea Gulf of Guinea Commission, can be very careful in providing the data we may need in this case. I support, left to me, that this is now a desideratum. We need to go along this type of thinking, and not necessarily to be saying that we want peace, zone of peace. The superpowers themselves do not want peace, one, and they are operating thinking along the thinking of von Clausewitz, who has told us that, look, you want peace, you prepare for war. So a zone of peace in this case should actually be anticipating the likelihood of war to be imposed on us, on the South Atlantic countries, and then prepare for that. So since we moved from balance of power to balance of interest in international relations, I think what I will expect the diplomatists that Ambassador Akisanya and Ambassador Lewu are would be now, how do we address the problematics of the past, the challenges of the past, the obstacles to why, for instance, it has not worked in the past. And then we put the likely solutions on the table and we begin to move forward. We must always expect that people will always want to create obstacles, to kill initiatives, to move forward. Didn't Ambassador Akisanya lead in the promotion of economic diplomacy, bringing the private sector to establish an, I think, a library or somewhere where, for instance, empirical education is given. I remember that particular time when he was working with Foreign Minister Ike Nwachukwu. What's the situation as of today? Does it still exist? Are they promoting it? So our culture is such that you need 1 or 2 or 3 people to move the country forward so that Nigeria can be relevant. Without doing this, I cannot see how Nigeria can be relevant, even with all the promises being made by the president-elect.
Thank you very much for that, sir. To Professor Akinyemi, there is a question to throw in the mix here, sir. And this one regards something that Professor Akinteriwa talked about, some of the challenges. How do we address some of those challenges that may hinder Nigeria from being able to take a leading role? And something came to my mind. When we look at South Africa is already very close with Russia in terms of, if we think back to some of the training that's been taking place in Russia, that alone in itself could be a big challenge and a deterrent for South Africa to say, I'm choosing between the relationship with Russia and creating this new organization that Russia may immediately think is another NATO that they're going to have to contend with in that region of the world. How do you overcome those kind of obstacles that they may be faced with in South Africa?
Well, thank you. And I must thank Professor Akinteriwa for a point he made about not fighting the battle of the past, but we face the one of today and seek to address that. Fortunately, South Africa is still not too far embedded within the embrace of Russia. And Russia and South Africa could still be amenable to the conviction that part of why we wouldn't want antagonism in the South Atlantic Ocean is not to have a relationship with one of the major superpowers, because there's an action and reaction are equal and opposite. The fact that Russia is there is in fact likely to bring the opposite side. But right now, this, what I'm suggesting, it will not be targeting anybody or any country particularly. First point. Second point, let us thank our creator that we are not a banana republic. Somebody gave me a figure yesterday that with all the best will in the world, $28 billion, $28 billion is still likely to be stolen in terms of the value of our crude oil next year. And I told him he was being too pessimistic. If we can really get a government that allows for 10% leakage, we can draw down on that figure. And that is just in the crude oil area alone. We have the LNG, the liquefied natural gas. We have all these mineral resources, especially in the north, which are simply being stolen by foreigners. I will not demonize any foreign entity here, but foreigners, and flown out of the country without any value to Nigeria, the Nigerian economy. Instead, we are left with holes dug in the ground. If we are not careful, what is happening in the Congo is likely to happen in the northern part of this country. Now, it's not too late, again, to put a stop to that. And that increases the value to our economy. And that's why I say we are not a banana republic. We have the resources that we need to carry on this, to carry on this project. I mean, if I were the president of this country and I want to make an impact, I am not going to start by mouthing Africa is the centerpiece of our foreign policy. ECOWAS, we must do this in ECOWAS. I will look for something new to do, something that will capture the imagination, not only of fellow Nigerians, but of the world without sinking the economy. And what I will do is to make an approach to Brazil. Really, Brazil wants to get out of the Ambassador Leo, you were in Brazil. Maybe you will fill in whatever gaps and leading. But I read in the body language of this new, well, not so new, president of Brazil, who has now gone off to China in order to repair the damage done by his predecessor. I will reach out to him and I will come up with this idea. This is not a challenge to Brazil. It's not a challenge to anybody in the Atlantic Ocean. At present, it's a cooperative venture that I will be offering him. And he will probably bring in Argentina, and I will bring in Angola, and that will bring in South Africa. And all we will be saying is, we don't want to be dragged into anybody's problem. We don't want to be appendages to anybody's conflict. That is really what I will do. We will still give our usual speeches at the UN annually, but this is something that will even, I mean, it's, to me, governance is coming up with great initiatives.
I can see Ambassador Shola Enikonlaye. Can you please unmute yourself, sir? And while you do that, Professor Akinyemi, I have a question here for you, sir. And it's one that borders on governance. NATO has been in existence since, I think it was 1949. There's quite a lot of governance experience that would have been gained in that process and in that time. Starting a new organization, and as is being proposed now, wouldn't they be starting on a back foot when it comes to governance and working together? So I just want to put that out there in your mind. But Ambassador Shola Enikonlaye, do you please want to make your point, sir?
Thank you very much, sir, Mr. Moderator. Let me start I want to make two comments, one comment and a question. And I start by thanking our eminent professor and mentor, Professor Akinyemi, for the idea he has just proposed. I'm convinced that one of the ways Nigeria can offer effective leadership in Africa and indeed the rest of the world is the quality of ideas that we espouse. It's not just leadership by mouth alone, but we need to put these ideas across in a very succinct, clear manner so that other countries can buy into them, while we also maintain what I will call the collegiate leadership in espousing them. This, of course, will revolve a lot of consultation. I know from experience that we need to do more. We don't consult enough in Nigeria foreign policy, which is why, not surprisingly, sometimes when we go out there, the ideas we try to put across, or even when we seek support for our candidates, they get knocked down or knocked off. We need to do more. The second point I'd like to make, which is a question, is what I notice is lack of sufficient recognition of the significance of foreign policy, its contribution to national development in our country. Which is why, as Ambassador Akinyemi alluded to, the debate about foreign policy in the current environment had been mooted. I think Prof would like to comment. How do we get Nigerians to better appreciate the role of foreign policy in their lives? The linkage between foreign policy and domestic policy in a manner that we even sort of democratize foreign policy making and implementation, that Nigeria can easily buy into any idea, including the laudable strategic proposal that Prof had just made. But unless we do that, we'll be leaving Nigerians behind, and they are not likely to buy into this idea. And when you don't have a domestic basis for such ideas, it will be difficult for you to even carry them across, not just to West Africa, but to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. The issue you have raised will have to be addressed by making Nigerians see their interests being protected and advanced by our activities abroad. There's no doubt that we are getting a bad rap all over Africa. We are getting a bad rap. Some of it is due to the activities of our nationals abroad. But I think we can do more by adopting this principle of reciprocity and doing it sharp. Times as they will say, you hurt my citizens over there, I will hurt your citizens over here. and the linkage will be very, very clear. Let me give an illustration. We know how even our diplomats, not to talk about our citizens, are treated in North Africa. Now, there was a time, and those of you who served in multinational positions may recognize this. The United States arrested an Indian consul general in New York. I've forgotten what she did, but they arrested her and they claimed that she didn't have diplomatic immunity, and they were going to put her on trial. What did India do? India simply withdrew the military and police protection unit that it has put to protect the United States embassy in New Delhi. Because as you know, United States always getting into trouble in one part of the world. And before you know it, people will start throwing stones and try to break into embassies. Within 2 days, the Americans released that lady, although they asked her to leave New York, and India put back the security cordon that they normally give to the embassies there. Now, I have heard and I have read about way and manner our nationals are treated in North Africa. And I expect, even if it is only going to sponsor demonstrations against their embassies here. And while the permanent secretary will be condemning the demonstrators, the police will be told to leave them alone, even if they start to throw stones. But the message will get across. Number one, to those who will treat our people, that we could retaliate here. Then number two, our own citizens as well. If we do that now, because there's sadly a day you open the newspaper, you don't see planes flying back our citizens from Libya, from Tunisia, and from those kind of places. Bring them back, rehabilitate them. I'm just giving this as, if you like, elementary illustrations of the things we can do, both at home and abroad, to let people know we are not going to turn a blind eye to the ill treatment of our citizens. Thirdly, is the issue of the economic bargains that our citizens will get from their businesses over there that we must seek to protect because we're also allowing their own citizens to operate there. This relates, in fact, the number of Arab and Lebanese citizens working in northern Nigeria. Go to Kaduna. You will think you are in an Arab country, and yet our people don't have the opportunity, and so we will have to now start saying, well, a lot of these people don't have papers in any case. They fly in. I know the problem which we will have, which is that we are not united. Not all the people in Nigeria will see them as foreigners the way I see them. But well, we just have to work at it. This is a problem with if a president will take that on board, as one of the things he will have to do to make sure that our citizens gain advantages from our foreign policy initiatives, he will just have to be educated to do so. The question that the moderator raised about will NATO not consider SATO as being mounted on them? We are not mounting it on them. We are not even using it to challenge them, because right now I am not aware that NATO wants to spread into the South Atlantic. I mean, there are say pockets of presence, you know, whether by the American, African, military, whatever they call it, or now that even Russia is saying that, you know, it wants to establish a presence, you know, but we are not a target yet. So we are not targeting anybody, but we are preparing for the days when, by the time they now feel they should move here, they themselves will meet a protective presence. That's all. We are not challenging NATO. We are not challenging the United States. And we are not challenging China. China's interest is still in the South Pacific, far, far, far from us. But let us be prepared.
Yes, sir. One last question for tonight. I can see iPhone again. I'm not sure if it's the same iPhone as before, but please do go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. This is Ambassador Lewy again. I'm very excited by the remarks of some of my friends, Professor Akin Akinyemi, my colleague Akin Akinyemi, and Enikon Lai. There was a question that was asked: how could Professor advance his ideas within the South Atlantic as a treaty? It is not easy to do because of the various interests that are involved, both within the region and also externally. But we may have to take the bull by the horn. If this is a suggestion from Nigeria, Nigeria may have to be the lead country, perhaps bring in Brazil as its partner. During the period of Obasanjo and Lula, both of them were presidents at the same time. They were great friends. In fact, I could say they were brothers. There were bilateral agreements between Nigeria and Brazil, and everything worked out very well. And that was the period when this issue of South Atlantic as a zone of peace and cooperation should exist. It was actually started by them and supported by the United Nations and became a UN issue. The main issue at that time was that the South Atlantic should not be a zone for nuclear powers to contest against each other. And that's why that issue came up. And I'm happy that the professor is talking about the issue of the assets within the region, particularly in the sea and inside the land, the inland, the various minerals, both inland and offshore, onshore and offshore, which are being exploited discriminately by various big powers, particularly when I remember when I was in Sierra Leone during the peacekeeping operations, China was a big problem for Sierra Leone because they had that big drag nets, which, as the professor said, will scoop everything from the underground to the top. And because China had helped Sierra Leone was almost helpless until the UN started taking some reproach against China that this was not good enough. Lead countries are necessary because during the civil war in Sierra Leone and during the peacekeeping operations in Sierra Leone, it was Britain that was the lead country that helped to draft all the various resolutions that led to peacekeeping operations, aided by United States. Without lead countries, all the countries combined may not be able to work in harmony unless you have a particular strong one among them or two strong ones that can work together and bring along the others through their own influence. That is very important. It is hoped that whoever becomes the president in Nigeria, the idea may be sold to him. And thank God Lula knows very well about the South Atlantic Treaty of South Atlantic Zone of Peace and Cooperation. Again, we have, of course, the Guinea, what do you call it? Where our lady is the director there, the one in charge.
Yeah, Gulf of Guinea Commission.
Thank you, Gulf of Guinea Commission. It is so important that Nigeria has not actually been very active in it, even though we have a person there. But this is the time when we have to get it revived in a way that we have to show the light, because we are actually the ones that should be the leader in that respect. So my point is that while we are talking about the new treaty that the professor is espousing, let us go back and check out what happened to the zone of peace and cooperation that existed, so that we shall not be accused of saying, oh, we have seen this all over. It's a deja vu. What are you coming up again? So let us look at what they have done, where the gaps are, and where the professor's ideas can fit into those gaps, and bring it up to be a living organism, rather than just talk over talks upon talks without any positive impacts to the regions concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, sir. Professor Akinyemi, do you want to respond to that, sir?
No, I just want to say that's a good summary of all what was said in the past 1 hour. And I know there will be people on this platform who will have links with, either with people who are about to be appointed or who would be appointed, and who, before they get bogged down, could sell to them some of these ideas. But that's a good summary from Ambassador Liu.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our viewers. Next week, we will be dealing with the third point, and I am really excited about that, because is it one step too far? Which countries out there have their space programs helped to drive their foreign policy? It will be good for us to debate that next week and have contributions from different people on that particular point. So next week, it's all about the third point. It's looking at being part of a space program and building out a space program as a means of extending the foreign policy reach of Nigeria and moving us into that next level. So till then, we look forward to everyone being back here next week. Thank you all for tonight. Thank you very much, Prof. We will be back next week. Thank you. Good night, all.
Thank you.
1 hour.
Good night, sir. Thank you, sir.